Hello everyone. Welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In this episode, we will take an in-depth look at the battle between primordial white Testarossa and divine ancestor Twilight Valentine. So, let's get started. The focus shifted to Testarossa, who, despite feeling irritated by the idle chatter from those outside the battlefield, never lost sight of her objective. Her strategy for victory had already taken shape in her mind. Perched above, Twilight initiated the confrontation with a taunting remark. From his perspective, Testarossa, who had no chance of winning, should be the one to attack first. However, Testarossa's sheer confidence was beyond anything Twilight had expected. With her usual elegance, she mocked Twilight for thinking he had the upper hand. Twilight, visibly annoyed, recalled how he had been reduced to dust in a single strike by his beloved daughter Luminous. Yet, he never considered that event a defeat. Rather, it was merely an inevitable experiment. This time, Twilight was eager to test the limits of his pseudo-dragon body and deliberately tried to provoke Testarossa into fighting seriously. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, until he realized that Testarossa's grasp of the situation was far from precise than he had anticipated. This realization dampened his excitement. He lectured Testarossa, claiming that demons always assumed themselves to be the strongest, consistently underestimating their opponents. But those who failed to recognize true strength would inevitably face defeat. However, Testarossa remained utterly unimpressed. She regarded his words with nothing but disdain, which further infuriated Twilight. As we discussed in the previous episode, Twilight was the type who relished imposing his beliefs on others. When things did not go his way, it frustrated him immensely. Enraged, he finally unleashed the fighting spirit he had been suppressing, an undeniable, overwhelming draconic aura. The so-called pseudo-dragon body was Twilight's ultimate masterpiece, the culmination of extensive research into immortality. The logical conclusion of such studies inevitably led to the true dragons, beings who were immortal and indestructible, capable of perfectly reconstructing their souls. Yet, even that was not enough for Twilight. True dragons, upon resurrection, would lose fragments of their memories or personalities. But Twilight believed that only by perfectly preserving both the core and memory could one be considered the ultimate life form. The essence of the soul, the most vital components, memory and core, how to replicate them. That was the essence of Twilight's research. Using himself as the test subject, Twilight had effortlessly achieved memory replication. By synchronizing with numerous pre-prepared clones, he ensured that even in death, his memories would remain intact. It was evident that this technique was modeled after Velgrine's parallel existence. However, recreating the core proved far more challenging. Unlike memories, the core was intangible and could shift over time. Unless one possessed Velzurd's ability to freeze their own heart, maintaining a consistent core indefinitely was impossible. And yet, in his madness, Twilight had found a breakthrough. He had requested none other than Velzurd-sama to freeze and safeguard his core. With his core preserved, he could implant his duplicated memories into his astral form, allowing him to continue his existence as he pleased. His memory synchronization was so flawless that even Luminous, the one closest to him, would likely be unable to tell the difference. And now, Twilight had taken his research even further, using Velzurd's magicules as the foundation to craft the ultimate physical body. His reborn soul resided within this pseudo-dragon body, with memory synchronization perfected to an absolute degree. This body was imbued with combat capabilities nearly rivaling that of a true dragon. Moreover, should anything go wrong, Twilight's core was safeguarded by Velzurd. In the event of destruction, he could simply create a new pseudo-dragon body and revive himself without any loss. However, Twilight considered such an outcome highly unlikely. While his total magicule energy could not compare to Velzurd's, his magic output was on par. Even against the White Queen, Testarossa, Twilight saw no reason why he should lose. More importantly, he believed his ultimate skill placed him above all. Twilight's original one was the unique skill, greed. Through extensive research, he had gained complete control over it and embedded his consciousness into the skill itself, releasing it as a seed of greed. This seed naturally gravitated toward the most avaricious individuals, passing through multiple hosts until it reached Maria Belrasso and was ultimately stolen by Yuki Kagarazaka. Throughout this process, Twilight continuously observed and synchronized his consciousness with greed, embedding traces of his persona into it. When greed latched onto Yuki, Twilight even experienced Primordial Red, Gi Crimson's overwhelming power firsthand. However, sensing Gi's dangerous nature, he severed the synchronization, leaving the skill to act autonomously. This part was explained in our episode 29. Yuki, by sheer luck, survived the ordeal and ultimately sacrificed greed to obtain the ultimate skill, Lord of Greed. Twilight, ever the observer, recorded the entire sequence of events. Later, when Yuki used Lord of Greed to counteract Michael's Lord of Justice, Regalia Dominion, he substituted himself with the consciousness in the Lord of Greed, actually a replica of Twilight's stored consciousness. From that moment onward, Twilight lost track of Lord of Greed's fate. But that no longer mattered, because Twilight had obtained his own ultimate skill, Lord of Avarice. Unlike the angelic 7 virtues or the demonic 7 deadly sins, Lord of Avarice was neither inherently good nor evil. It was a pure embodiment of endless desire, a manifestation of Twilight's boundless thirst for research. Whether the world descended into chaos or prospered meant nothing to him. What mattered was achieving the results he sought. His utter lack of malice made him the purest incarnation of viciousness. And his insatiable curiosity inevitably led him to pursue the ultimate question: what lay beyond the limits of ultimate skills? In his unrelenting quest, Twilight sacrificed Lord of Avarice, and in doing so, obtained something that should not have existed: the terrifying ultimate skill, Lord of Viciousness. Twilight was ecstatic. This power surpassed even Veldanavasama's original creations, the 7 virtues, as well as their corresponding 7 deadly sins. While the Lord of Viciousness was specialized for creation and research, it also granted him overwhelming combat capabilities. Among its many abilities, several stood out: skill duplication, skill synchronization, and eternal regression. It was thanks to Lord of Viciousness's unparalleled ability to create and research that the pseudo-dragon body had finally been perfected. Twilight was convinced, so long as Velzard existed, he was immortal and invincible. Returning to the battle, Twilight unleashed his dragon aura, exerting immense pressure on Testarossa. The pseudo-dragon body possessed existence points nearly 10 times greater than Testarossa's, creating a seemingly insurmountable gap between them. Because of this overwhelming advantage, Twilight remained composed, unable to comprehend Testarossa's ridiculous level of confidence. Thus, their battle commenced. However, after several hours, they remained locked in a standoff midair. Testarossa remained fully focused, dedicating herself entirely to the fight. The formula for victory had already formed in her mind, but solving it was no easy task. To prevent Twilight from catching on, she proceeded with extreme caution, steadily maneuvering the battle to her advantage. Twilight, however, sensed that something was off. He effortlessly erased Testarossa's relentless time-lagged consecutive nuclear magical strikes, an exceptionally advanced technique that should have been astonishing. Yet, instead of feeling satisfaction, he found himself growing irritated. Testarossa's attacks failing to damage him was expected, but why, after his prolonged counterattacks, she was still completely unharmed? It simply made no sense. Indeed, though Testarossa's entire body was drenched in blood, she continued soaring through the air with unwavering determination. The battle lust burning in her had not wavered in the slightest. At that moment, Twilight was engulfed in white flames, Testarossa's signature technique, white flare. During their hours-long deadlock, she had been waiting for the perfect opportunity, striking the very instant Twilight became momentarily distracted. It was as if she had calculated this exact timing. Only now did Twilight realize. Most of Testarossa's attacks for sure had been ineffective, but Twilight himself had still been too cautious to let his guard down. This, in turn, led to his growing frustration, exactly what Testarossa had been waiting for. The searing flames triggered pain receptors within Twilight's body, an attack that evoked an instinctive sense of death. After all, this was an ultimate single-target annihilation spell, created through Testarossa's ultimate skill, Lord of Underworld. In an instant, Twilight's pseudo-dragon body was reduced to ashes. Yet, it did not matter. As if nothing had happened, Twilight's body completely regenerated. Twilight scoffed at Testarossa's foolishness, mocking her persistence. How many times did he need to tell her? No attack could harm him. But deep down, Twilight's instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. Logically, White Flare should have been Testarossa's strongest technique. It had pierced through multiple layers of Twilight's defensive barriers, instantly incinerating his pseudo-dragon body. She had endured for hours just to create this one opening. Everything should have made sense in this way. And yet, Testarossa's reaction shook Twilight again. There was no despair in her expression, no sign of hopelessness at her trump card failing. Instead, Testarossa's demeanor was one of condescension, a smirk that bordered on mockery. At last, Twilight understood the source of his unease. Despite being struck multiple times, accumulating numerous wounds, Testarossa remained unharmed. She should not have been able to keep fighting unimpeded. Twilight's attacks, lethal to Demon Lord seeds with one hit, had hit Testarossa countless times. And yet, she was fine. There could be only one explanation: Testarossa was getting hit on purpose. But why? Twilight wanted to figure out. Twilight's greatest flaw, the weakness born from his greatest vice, was his insatiable curiosity. In reality, all of this had been within Testarossa's expectations, including Twilight's overconfidence. Yes, in terms of raw combat ability, Twilight was undeniably superior to Testarossa. However, in this battle, they were evenly matched. In fact, one could even say that the situation was entirely under Testarossa's control. This was the importance of battle experience. Testarossa calmly stated that it was precisely Twilight's arrogance and lack of combat experience that had given her the opportunity to win. If she were in his position, she would have ended the fight immediately, without giving her opponent any chance to strategize. Twilight gritted his teeth, feeling intensely irritated as he stared at Testarossa's confident and alluring smile. He simply could not understand what possible means she had to defeat him. Twilight's pseudo-dragon body, created from Velzard's magicule, was capable of infinite regeneration. His core, protected by Velzard, ensured his immortality. He was invincible, 100%. Frustrated beyond measure, Twilight decided to unleash his strongest attack, Eternal Twilight. The ultimate skill, Lord of Viciousness, represented the will of a god-slayer, a power signifying Twilight's destined role of surpassing his progenitor, Veldanava. Even allowing Luminous to kill him in the past had been nothing more than an experiment, an observation of this preordained fate. Though Lord of Viciousness transcended the 7 deadly sins, it lacked the ultimate dominion authority that granted control over others. Demons inherently embodied freedom, making them incompatible with abilities that involved control and domination. However, Lord of Viciousness still possessed one terrifying absolute ability: eternal regression. This power trampled upon free will, trapping everything within its range in a hellish void, where they would eternally relive their worst nightmares until the end of time. Eternal Twilight was Twilight's offensive application of this forbidden ability. A tide of malevolent energy surged toward Testarossa. Twilight threw his head back in laughter, eagerly anticipating the sight of this primordial demon, this being even older than himself, being devoured by the very essence of despair. A darkness more absolute than the void itself threatened to consume the white world. And yet nothing happened. Testarossa remained floating in place, completely untouched. Twilight's shock was immeasurable. This was not the excitement he felt when an experiment yielded unexpected results. No, this was something else entirely. What unfolded before him defied reason, an absurdity that shattered even his boundless knowledge. Testarossa's rosy lips curved into a sinister grin. With a voice that heralded true despair, she calmly declared that her preparations were complete. Then, executing the plan she had formulated from the very beginning, Testarossa took action. The world was drenched in white. Her ability, Nihilistic End, spread forth, an all-encompassing white darkness that swallowed everything. Even Moss, Rain, and the others, safely sheltered behind protective barriers, could see nothing beyond. Yet, what truly stunned them was not the sheer power of the protective barrier, but rather the invisible membrane coating its surface, an additional layer so unfathomably strong that even Rain and Misery found themselves at a loss for words. It was Testarossa's additional protection barrier. On the battlefield, Twilight's thoughts accelerated to an unimaginable speed. He processed everything at 10 more million times the normal rate, desperately trying to grasp the situation. He could not comprehend how his flawless eternal Twilight had failed against Testarossa. Nor could he understand the nature of the white darkness engulfing him. But one thing was clear, the white darkness was consuming his body faster than he could regenerate. However, Twilight remained composed. Even if his body were obliterated, he could simply create another pseudo-dragon body. There was nothing to fear. And yet, at that exact moment, a thought communication from Testarossa pierced into his accelerated mind space. Twilight was still in the midst of analyzing when he suddenly realized something. This power, this void, was something Testarossa had subtly used before, when probing for his hidden presence. Twilight actually found himself impressed. The fact that she had been maintaining such a high-cost ability this entire time was nothing short of extraordinary. The void was an ultimate destructive force. Integrating it seamlessly into the environment and sustaining it in a harmless state required an astronomical amount of energy. However, it was an incredibly inefficient tactic. Direct attacks would have been far more effective. Twilight found it completely illogical. But it did not matter. He was immortal. Even if his current body and soul were erased, his core, protected by Velzard, would allow him to simply resurrect once more. However, it was at this precise moment that Twilight made a fatal miscalculation. Testarossa sighed, remarking that Twilight still understood nothing. She then stated that her void did not originate from the depths of hell. Twilight, both confused and irritated, narrowed his eyes. But Testarossa merely continued, declaring that this power was proof of that great being's existence. Everything she had meticulously planned up to this point was merely to stall Twilight, forcing him to expend time alongside her. And the reason for doing so is to open the gate buried deep within her heart. Now that it had finally opened, she could distinctly sense that presence, the presence of the great Rimuru-sama. Though Testarossa wished to relish the sensation a bit longer, she knew that her task was now complete. She was not like Sejin, who sought to wield forces beyond his own capabilities. She understood her own limits. Even a restricted amount of this power was more than enough of a threat. Testarossa's ultimate skill, Lord of the Underworld, granted her access to the rare world system authority. Afterworld, the very foundation of her nihilistic world ability. This power granted her dominion over the netherworld's deepest flames, the void itself. And for this reason, if she replaced its source with Rimuru's imaginary collapse and fused it with her own nihilistic world, she could assimilate and command this extraordinarily dangerous world at will. The void, by its very nature, could even devour Infan itself. More precisely, it erased the information contained within Infan. No matter how instantaneous the transmission of knowledge across space and time, once the Infan itself was obliterated, nothing could be relayed. That was why Twilight now found that his core no longer responded to his commands. Testarossa's voice turned cold as she declared game over. The thought communication between them abruptly vanished, plunging Twilight's mental space into utter isolation once more. He simply could not accept that Testarossa's white darkness was composed entirely of void. It defied all conventional logic. Controlling even a fragment of the void was an incredibly complex feat, and while Twilight had taken precautions to isolate himself, Testarossa had nonetheless flooded his space with the void and taken control of it. No such existence should have been possible, even among the strongest of beings. Even the creator god Veldonava had never demonstrated such power. Twilight's consciousness was devoured by the white darkness and vanished into nothingness. He had hoped to extract answers from Testarossa, to satisfy his endless curiosity. Yet, in the end, all that remained was another unanswered question, leaving his insatiable hunger for knowledge forever unfulfilled. The perspective shifted to those within the protective barrier. Though they struggled to grasp what was unfolding outside, an unshakable sense of confidence in Testarossa's victory filled the air. It wasn't just that they couldn't imagine her losing. Testarossa never engaged in battles she wasn't absolutely sure she could win. Moreover, the white darkness engulfing the battlefield exuded an overwhelming, primal fear, a force that struck at the very core of their beings. For Moss, this sensation was particularly pronounced. He could keenly sense Testarossa-sama's wrath, and just before the white barrier sealed the space, he had caught a fleeting glimpse of Testarossa's body covered in wounds. This was an event far beyond Moss's understanding, for in his knowledge, Testarossa relied almost exclusively on magic, rarely engaging in direct combat. Her specialty lay in defense and ranged assaults, and she would never foolishly fight on an opponent's terms. The fact that she had done so now felt entirely unnatural. Even Rain and Misery admitted that Testarossa must have had a deeper strategy in mind. It was only after Sauka's unintentional comment that Moss recalled something crucial. Testarossa's nihilistic world had only been in its first phase. Yet he, Sauka, and the others remained unharmed. Theoretically, this meant one thing: Testarossa had deactivated the Void's standby mode, for if she hadn't, everyone would have perished long ago. Meanwhile, Moss refused to believe that Testarossa had recklessly fought for so long while actively maintaining the Void. However, as Twilight's body continued to erode, both Rain and Misery became certain of one thing: the Void was indeed at play. A chill ran down their spines as the full extent of Testarossa's power sank in. Testarossa's power was far beyond their common senses now. Just as their speculations reached a fever pitch, Twilight's existence began to fade. Seeing this, Rain erupted in joy, celebrating as if she had been the one to defeat Twilight herself. With a smug grin, she remarked that Twilight, that insufferable bastard, had finally learned his lesson. With the crisis averted, the tense atmosphere dissipated, and everyone let out a breath of relief. Rain then boasted that the result was totally expected from someone who once fought her to a draw. And by that logic, if Testarossa defeated Twilight, it also meant that Rain had technically won over Twilight too. Though she had done absolutely nothing, Rain still managed to justify herself in the most self-serving way possible. Yet, the greater issue remained unresolved. The entire continent was still engulfed in Velzard's undisturbed white-sealed world. It loomed ominously, serving as a stark reminder: the battle between Guy and Velzard was about to begin. Alright, that's all for this video. So far in the Tema Great War, the recurring theme among the antagonists, Michael, Felway, Zelenus, and Twilight, is that they all suffer from daddy issues. And the root cause of all these issues? The same one: existence, creator god Veldanava. As for this fight, there really wasn't much in terms of detailed combat sequences. It essentially boiled down to 3 key moves: White Flare, Eternal Twilight, and Nihilistic End. And naturally, the final blow against Twilight came from Rimuru's imaginary supply. The reason Testarossa deliberately stalled for time was to open the gate and access this power. From Twilight's perspective, we can also infer something critical. The power behind Rimuru's imaginary collapse now far surpasses anything Veldanava was ever capable of. This aligns perfectly with what Seal stated in episode 127, that Rimuru's strength was sufficient to create countless universes. As for Twilight, his core still resided within Velzard. Ultimately, the one who will completely erase Twilight in the future is Primordial Yellow, Carrera, a confrontation we will explore in future episodes. In our next episode, we shift our perspective to Guy and Velzard. Guy's overwhelming power will finally take center stage. The story will continue to be just as thrilling. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.